A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So now that we're starting a whole new week worth of content, I feel like that it's about time that we get to talk about a series that has been made by a somewhat short-lived company. If you happen to be familiar with anything about UEP systems, well, a good brief history is that UEP used to be a popular Japanese video game industry, especially catering to the likes of snowboarding games. You could consider this to be the era in which this was long before anything that came around to snowboarding or snow-related games as a whole. I would say that when it comes to modern day snowboarding games, Steep is probably where we're truly at. Even today, after nearly 10 years of time, it still holds the best possible advantage that you could possibly get. And I'm sure that there could be a PS5 version of the game or even a sequel in the works, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see how Sony puts it all together in the future. Anyways though, UEP was responsible for a certain series known as CoolBoarder's, a series that was more or less a predecessor to Steep and many other snowboarder games from nowadays. But what I will say is that having played only the first game, I actually never knew that snowboarding games like CoolBoarder's would actually become popular enough to be its own series. Well, I feel like the best way to describe this whole series is just go back to the beginning here. In 1996, during the days of the PlayStation 1, UEP would release their first CoolBoarder's title and simply bring about the unique coolness of snowboarding to modern audiences. You basically would have thought about such things like skateboarding and driving around in cars as cool sports, but not too many people had gotten the chance to try out anything snow-worthy. Snowboarding, skiing, sledding, etc. There are, of course, the epitome of different winter-related games out there, including the somewhat infamous Winter games by Acclaim, but that of which was just one mere example of something that's not supposed to be done when it comes to winter-based gaming. And CoolBoarder's tends to be a bit on the simplistic side as it is as well. Let's face it, UEP was definitely nothing like most modern-day developers and publishers. Despite the fact that they were primarily responsible for developing and publishing this game, there were loads of other developers and publishers out there as well. Such other cases would of course include Deck 9, 989, as well as Sony Interactive. But by all means, we could consider the fact that publications were not only done by UEP and 989 themselves, but SNK, Sega, and Capcom were in on it too. Wow. I mean, it just makes sense knowing the fact that there's a bit of an arcade implementation put together here. A bit of a phenomenon that Capcom was quite familiar with over the years. And then there was the somewhat aura that is known to be reflected in the game as well. Sega has had a bit of a reputation for that sort of thing as well. The kind of theming that they put together for something like this. Anyways though, with the first CoolBoarder's game, it's a pretty simple thing to put together here. It's all about getting your snowboarding skills, sharpening them up every step of the way as you advance through a novice, advanced, and an expert course. 3 different courses, 2 different characters with customizable outfits as well as different snowboards with different colors. It's as simple as you can pretty much get here. Though I will appreciate the variety that they were able to put together for something like this. The snowboards, their colors, as well as different outfits for whatever character you choose in the game. But either way you look at it, like I've said, simplicity happens to be one of the biggest parts of the first CoolBoarder's game. But it starts off when the clock goes up and you have a limited amount of time, so you got to make sure that you whiz through the checkpoints and occasionally pull some air through the cliffs. And when you do successfully make your grab and your stunts, you earn a good amount of points. There, of course, is the unique announcer in the background. Sort of caters to more like a surfing kind of thing. And I will admit, there are surfing games out there as well, even on modern consoles. But that's mainly a different sort of topic. Because on top of the fact that CoolBoarder's only has a few courses and a few different lengths of variety to choose from here, that's pretty much just what it is. You don't really get lots to work with the first game itself. However, that's not to say that this was the only sort of case in which that CoolBoarder's had come around here, because there were other games as well. In fact, there came along sequels for the game as well. In 97, there was CoolBoarder's 2, CoolBoarder's 3 in 98. It kind of follows along in a similar sort of trilogy implementation that Tomb Raider had known for. Tomb Raider also came out in 96, 97, and 98. But there, of course, was also Rippin' Rider snowboarding, which almost had nothing to do with it. However, this was, believe it or not, also made possible by UEP systems. One could consider this to be, let's say, a sister game by any means. But it didn't do all too well for the time. CoolBoarder's 4, of course, would come out that same year in 1999. There was even a pocket version made for the Neo Geo Pocket Color in 2000. And then there were two other games that came around. CoolBoarder's Code Alien, which tried to do something different. However, because of the fact that it flopped, it was mostly only made as a Japanese release. And I'll talk a bit more about what it did for the future of UEP in just a moment. Finally, there was CoolBoarder's 2001. And well, this was pretty much one of the only PS2 games that came around. And that was because, unfortunately, remember Code Alien? Well, it turns out UEP ended up sealing their own fate. With the implementation of Code Alien as well as CoolBoarder's 2001, they unfortunately didn't do a good enough job to allow for UEP to thrive any further. They would officially mark a full disbanding in summer of 2001, at around the same time that CoolBoarder's 2001 would come along to the marketplace. So, the fact that CoolBoarder's 2001 was more or less the send-off to the franchise and as a sign-off to the company, it pretty much just meant that they not only ran out of steam, but they also ran out of time for themselves. So, to say that UEP could have done better is probably more or less up for debate. But I really get the feeling that if UEP actually branched out, did more variety, and tried new things every now and then, maybe they could have been around a little while longer. After all, they were only founded in 1985 and lived for 16 years. Just think about it. 1985, that was the same year that the Nintendo Entertainment System was brought onto the world and took the fate of gaming in the United States by storm for pretty much everybody. We also can't forget to mention the fact that 16 years, there's a good amount of things that I could talk about that only live for that amount of time. 16 years from beginning to end. There was the Milwaukee Road Hiawatha, and that lived for 16 years between 1935 and 1951. And there was also some people that unfortunately didn't make it past the age of 16. Yeah, I feel like that it's a bit more of a morbid cause here, but something that we don't really need to touch on all too well here. Because the point is that the CoolBoarder's series actually did a good job at giving us something snowboard related or winter related on the face of gaming. Back then, there weren't all too many cases like this. But since then, we have gotten many other cases out there. I mean, we have not only Steep to work with, but there's also a few other titles every now and then that we seem to get that are more or less winter related. I mean, you have SnowRunner, which is more or less driving around in snow and off-road vehicles. There was also the occasional thing with Riders Republic, which I feel like I might as well talk about soon. But other than that, the CoolBoarder's games from 1996 to to 2001, it lived for a decent amount of time and actually managed to garner a lot of titles. The fact they didn't cross over to many consoles is one thing, and the fact that they were able to thrive for longer than what most people would have assumed to be is an entirely different case. But UAP, again, had they done things a lot differently back then, branching out and trying new variety on things, they probably could have lived a while longer than they did. Probably even all the way to today, coexisting alongside many other well-known developers and publishers. But I suppose that just won't be happening. In any case though, being that I only played the first CoolBoarder's game, I can't really give out a good scoring based on the entirety of the franchise, but at least for what I did with the first game, it's a rather simple thing. A bit too simple, even by PlayStation 1 standards. For 1996, I'm sure there's plenty of other titles out there that were able to do so much more, given the fact that the PlayStation's own hardware and capabilities really proved to go beyond the extra mile. So for the first CoolBoarder's game, the only one I played so far, I'll probably have to give it a somewhat medial, maybe generous scoring. We'll just go with 7.0. A standard fare scoring from us that still does the job. But I can't say that it's that good of a title, even for the time. So, either way you look at it, there's not a whole lot more I can say about this or the rest of the franchise. But it's at least a good piece of history that I was able to touch up on, regardless of the circumstances at hand. So anyways, this has been Monday's piece for video games that are totally awesome, and for the rest of this week, we'll have plenty more to cover here, including a whole trilogy. But first, we'll touch up on another piece that took place many years ago. So tune in tomorrow on Tuesday, and I will see you guys then.